We are pleased to welcome Edward Wong to the MoCA Collection Archive and Oral History Studio in Chinatown. Edward is the diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times, where he's reported on the Iraq War, U.S. diplomacy, and for 10 years was stationed in China as the New York Times Beijing bureau chief. And his new book is titled At the Edge of Empire, A Family's Reckoning with China. So, Edward, welcome.
Thanks a lot, Herb. And it's great for me to be here because my family has a long history of Chinatown, both in DC and in New York.
Yeah, and actually, just for the recording, could you just state your full name,
Sure.
like all the names you have,
Yeah.
and then and also just your affiliation, just for the record?
Yeah. I'm Edward Wong. I'm currently the diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times. It's a job I've been doing since 2018. I'm also an author, and my book was published by Viking last year in 2024. My English name is Edward Wong. My Cantonese name is Wong An Wai. And in Mandarin, that's Huang An Wei. So those are the different versions of my Chinese name.
Is there a story behind how you got those names, either the Chinese name and your English name too?
Yeah, I don't think there's a particular story. My sister and I both share, one of the words in our first names because, as I think you might know, many of the people who are born in the same generation of family often share one word in their first name, and that's An, peace, for me and my sister. But other than that, I don't think there's a particular story behind the Chinese name. English name, I think my parents were just looking for a name that sounded like an Anglo name. They both spent considerable time in Hong Kong when it was a British colony. So Edward seems like a fairly Anglo name that probably various Hong Kong Chinese adopted at one point or another.
Right, right. And so you said you were born in Hong Kong?
I was born in Washington
Okay.
D.C. In 1972. My parents have different relationships with Hong Kong. So my father was born in Hong Kong in 1932, and he had his early childhood there. Living in a row house in the Happy Valley neighborhood of Hong Kong. My mother immigrated to Hong Kong when she was fairly young, before she was a teenager, and her story is somewhat different because she was born in the Kaiping area of Guangdong or Huiping, and she and her family fled to Hong Kong in the late 1950s because the communists were doing their land seizure policy and also persecuting landowners. And so they had their land stripped from them in Kaiping County and then fled to Hong Kong. My father's story is the opposite. He was born in Hong Kong and then went to Guangdong and then to many other parts of China after the Communist Revolution.
I see. And yeah, we'll get to your father's story a little bit
Yeah.
later. But so born and raised in Washington D.C. I mean, what were some early formative memories of
Um,
where you grew up and what? And you said the neighborhood was called Happy Valley. Was that right?
Yeah, Happy Valley is my father's neighborhood
Okay.
that he
Okay.
grew up in Hong Kong. I was born in Chinatown. I mean, I was born in the women's hospital in D.C., which is in the city, and then spent most of the first year of my life in Chinatown. My parents were living in an apartment building there, and along with my grandmother on my father's side, and my father was working in a restaurant in Chinatown called Jade Palace. And then in almost a year after I was born, they decided to move out to the suburbs to Alexandria, which I think was a fairly common trend for a lot of Chinese living in Chinatown of their generation. If they saved up enough money to move to suburbs, they jumped at that opportunity. And so my parents had enough money to make a down payment on a house in Alexandria, and they moved out there. And that's where I grew up. I grew up in Alexandria, which is one of the close-in suburbs to Washington. It's right on the banks of the Potomac, and had a fairly ordinary suburban upbringing in Alexandria with my younger sister of 2 years.
Mm-hmm. And what's the story of your parents immigrating to America. Why did they do that when they did it?
Yeah. They both came to America from Hong Kong. My father's story of how he ended up in Hong Kong after his period in the People's Republic of China is fairly complicated, and we can talk more about that later. But in any case, he ended up in Hong Kong in early 1963. Got a certificate in engineering after some more schooling there in his adult years, and then he came to America in 1967 with his grandmother, who was turning 90 at the time, and they came to America because his older brother, Sam, older by 4 years, had settled in America after studying here, and was working for the U.S. military at the time as an engineer and living in a suburb of D.C. And then they also had various other relatives, cousins, uncles who had moved to the DC area and were doing various professions out here, including running restaurants or working in restaurants. And so my father moved with his grandmother in 1967. They came to America, and of course we know that that's a couple years after the limits on Chinese immigration to America were lifted following the end of the Exclusion Act. And so they were able to get visas here, immigration visas. They came through Hawaii, and they first came to Chinatown, and that's where my father eventually soon found a job waiting tables at Jade Palace in D.C. And I have one of the photographs that I use in my book is one of the whole family gathered for my great grandmother's 90th birthday in Jade Palace itself, with all her extended family around her, including my father, my uncle, various members who had all immigrated to the D.C. area by then. And then my mother didn't come until 1971. And what happened was my father had been working here in Washington for a few years, and then he and his mother made some trips between D.C. and New York. I think that he and his mother lived in New York for a short spell. His father had passed away in Hong Kong by then. His father passed away in 1963. So he and his mother lived here in Chinatown in New York for a period, and he tried different jobs here, including in restaurant work on Mott Street. And then he eventually went back to D.C. because I think he had closer family ties there, including his older brother. And then at one point, he knew he wanted to get married, start raising a family. So then he went back to Hong Kong, and it was on a trip where he was very explicitly looking for a potential spouse. And so he had family members and friends who were setting him up on sort of dates or meetings with various women, and none of them really gelled, except one of the last meetings he had was with a woman that he had known because she was the younger sister of a man that he had gone to engineering school with in Hong Kong. And so he had played mahjong on weekends with that man, that student that was a friend of his, William. And so then he remembered her. He was a relative reminded him of her, and so he went and visited her, and then they ended up getting married that year in 1971 in Hong Kong, in the summer of 1971. And then my mother then comes to the U.S. A few months later, and then she came to U.S. Visited people here in New York Chinatown, and then they settled in D.C. Chinatown.
Wow, what a story.
Yeah.
So it sounds like coming to America was a bit of family sort of reunification.
Yeah.
Because your dad sounds like he studied engineering,
Right.
Hong Kong, and then he comes and works in restaurants. I mean,
Yeah.
did he?
I think it was partly family reunification. Partly it was because Hong Kong's economy wasn't booming at that time in the late 1960s. So, and also there were some political tensions with the People's Republic because the Cultural Revolution had started. in the PRC, and so there was a little bit of unrest in Hong Kong. In fact, in 1967, on I think the week that my father flew to the U.S., like there had been some protests or riots by pro PRC, pro Mao groups in Hong Kong. Maybe there, I think there was also partly was wrapped up in a labor dispute as well, and then there were and then British police officers deployed tear gas, for instance. So there were some was a bit of political unrest in Hong Kong, but also the economic situation was not great. So I think that was partly the reason. Partly was unification, and then as you point out, my dad had gotten a certificate in engineering in Hong Kong, but when he came to the States, I think it was easiest to find restaurant work, which is what he did. And I think at that point he was already an older student when he got that certificate in Hong Kong. So I think he felt it would be really difficult to restart schooling again in the U.S. and get a degree in the U.S. to do engineering. So I think he stayed with restaurant work his entire life.
Um, yeah, and let's talk about you for a second. You know, your upbringing, your kind of youth. What were you interested in? Like, what kind of subjects? What were you good at school?
Uh,
And just like the story of how you like wound up working in
Being a
journalism.
journalist,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, went to a public elementary schools, public middle school, and public high school in Alexandria, and there was nothing, that was particularly striking about the schooling system in Alexandria at the time. But I had great teachers in my subjects. I did AP studies in different subjects when I was in high school: math, science, and English, and history. And I was, decent at math and science. My parents wanted me to eventually become a doctor, so I had that in the back of my mind. But I was also very much drawn to literature, and I remember being very much struck by a lot of the fiction books I read. I think both starting in middle school, George Orwell, for instance, Animal Farm, um, books like that, and then Beowulf from Old English, and then going up into high school where, there was in my junior year we had an American history course, American literature course, and I was very much struck by a lot of the American literature I read, The Great Gatsby, The Sun Also Rises, Willa Cather. So all of these different books and authors really left a mark on me, and I really fell in love with literature. I fell in love with reading. I read lots on the side. I read lots of fantasy and some science fiction, for instance, Lord of the Rings, different books like that. My daughter right now loves reading fantasy, so I think it might run in the family.
Rubbed off. Yeah.
Yeah, and my wife also grew up loving reading fantasy novels. So, yeah, so I just loved reading, and I think looking back, that's what planted the seeds, I think, for my interest in writing, and then later on, I got much more to travel overseas much later in after university, and that's what then planted the seeds for the other half of my interest in journalism, which is like international news, travel, and then that merged with my interest in writing, got me very interested in journalism when I was in my 20s.
Um, I'm interested in like your, I guess, life at home, and kind of the sort of how your parents raised you all, like
Yeah.
in terms of kind of navigating like cultures. Like
Hmm.
did you speak Chinese at home, or what did you speak at home, and then sort of like what was it like in terms of them teaching you like sort of like values, moral values, things that you might um, maybe think of as like Chinese cultural traditions, or what was that balance like,
Right.
at home?
I mean, I think like many immigrant parents, whether they're Chinese or from other countries, like my parents, obviously talked a lot about education, importance of schooling, and getting good grades in school, and making sure we studied. So that was, one important element in our household. Their Cantonese was much better than their English. So then we spoke in a mix of Cantonese and English. So I grew up knowing Cantonese. And when I hear Cantonese, it's much more instinctual in terms of my ability to understand it and hear the tones rather than the Mandarin, which is what I studied later on as an adult. And yeah, and my parents would just and their family like relatives would just speak Cantonese or Toisanese at family gatherings because my father is from his family roots are in Toisan or Hoisan in Guangdong, and my mother's are in, as I said, in Hoiping or Kaiping. So then those languages are the same, and so like they would be able to speak in that language with family members when they were together. Family members mainly of my father's generation. But my sister and I both grew up knowing Cantonese, speaking English as well. We didn't study the reading or writing of Chinese. I remember, just like many other friends I have, like my parents tried sending me to Chinese school on weekends, but I really rebelled against it. I thought it was difficult and boring and didn't really get into it. And it was only much later, of course, that I got into formally studying Mandarin, and I wished I had stuck with Chinese school earlier in my life. But studying written Chinese is very difficult, and I think it's a huge barrier to really mastering the language when you're younger, the written form of Chinese. So that was my upbringing, and my parents were very good about teaching us to respect other people, respect their ideas, their property, their just respect them as equals. And I think my mother did more of the sort of shaping of our intellectual and moral foundations because she was just more present at home. My father, because he had this restaurant job, was often gone for much of the day. He would leave in the morning, like late morning, after we had gone off to school, and then come back pretty late at night. So I would see him sometimes before I went to bed, but oftentimes he might come home after I already gone to bed. And then he also worked often on he would work 6 days a week at the restaurant, this restaurant Sampan Cafe in Alexandria. And then he also, for part of the time when I was a child, he also co-owned another restaurant, like a sort of more low-end takeout restaurant called Chin's Kitchen, also in the area. And then he would work, every other Sunday at that restaurant. So there would be many days when I didn't see much of him. And then, but I do remember some Sundays we would sit down together and watch football, like the Washington Redskins. He was very much into American football. We would sometimes, I remember when I was younger, we would sometimes go for long drives in the suburbs because he liked driving cars. And so like we'd go out for drives together as a family. And then and then we never had a lot of money, so we didn't go on these lavish vacations. During the summer when we were off from school, we would do very modest vacations, like going to Ocean City, Maryland, for a few nights in the hotel there, and that was, a 3-hour drive from DC.
So, yeah, we're just talking about your parents, your dad, and driving and
Yeah.
watching football. Um,
My dad also did a lot of yard work, and so many Sundays when he wasn't working in Chin's Kitchen, he would be present at the house working on our yard or on our roof or doing lots of different house chores.
he seemed to be somebody who liked to be busy and kind
Yeah.
of having his hands on many things.
And
right?
I think that came from his engineering training, also from probably his soldier training when he was a soldier in the People's Republic.
Could you talk about just your work career? How you got into journalism specifically. Like, what was your first job?
Yeah. So I wasn't, I was interested in literature, in English literature and fiction and novels going into university. I went to university at the University of Virginia down in Charlottesville, 2 hours away from Washington. And I did pre-med studies, and I was also an English major as I did pre-med studies. And then at the same time, I also dabbled a bit in the school newspapers. There were two school dailies, and I wrote a bit for both of them, the University Daily and or the University Journal and the Cavalier Daily. But I wasn't, very attracted to journalism. I was much more interested in literature at the time, and I took fiction writing seminars. And then I also finished the pre med curriculum, applied to med school, but then deferred for a year because I realized I wasn't, there was something about it that didn't really pull me. And I wasn't quite sure I wanted to go. And of course, my parents at the time were fairly disappointed, but I sort of, decided I was going to spend a year to just try and like feel out different things, see where things led. And one of the things I did was I went back to Washington, lived with my parents, worked odd jobs, including waiting tables and being an editorial assistant at a research group in the area. And then I saved up enough money and went on this long trip to Southern Europe and the Middle East, just backpacking for half a year across those countries. And then that was when I got very interested in sort of the societies of different places, in really meeting people from all over, and got very interested also in politics and geopolitics. And so I decided that maybe journalism was one way that I could try and make a living that would merge my interest in writing with my interest in travel, and in discovering for myself like new societies and new cultures. And so I came back to the DC area, and this was in the fall of '95, and applied for a job working at the Potomac Gazette, which was a weekly newspaper in Potomac, Maryland. And at that time, there was a series of weekly newspapers around suburban Washington, in different suburbs, and they were all owned by the Washington Post Company, and they were called the Gazette newspapers. And so I applied for, I saw a classified ad for this job at the Potomac Gazette, applied for it, got it. I ended up working at the Potomac Gazette as my very first newspaper job. I used the clips that I had gotten at my university newspapers as my writing sample, so I applied for that job. And so I reported on lots of different issues in Potomac, Maryland, things like zoning disputes, school issues, sort of like the bread and butter of community journalism, which I thought was great training. And then I decided I wanted to try and take the next step in my journalism career. I wasn't really sure how I would do that, and so I decided to apply to grad school in journalism. And I got into Berkeley and Columbia, and a few others, and decided that I would go to Berkeley because I really wanted to live in the Bay Area. And it was a 2-year program, and I thought a 2-year program might be better suited to give me more avenues to explore things. So, and then right before I went to grad school, I decided to go on a trip to China, because I was, by then, of course, I've been bitten by the travel bug. And then I started wondering about China because, we were ethnic Chinese, and the People's Republic seemed very intriguing. And so I signed on with a study group that was mostly Chinese Americans, a small group. And we went over to China, visited a few cities, and then I ended up studying in Beijing for the summer. And this was in the summer of 1996, and it was my first exposure to studying Mandarin outside of Chinese school when I was much younger. It was my first time in the People's Republic, and so I was like completely captivated by everything that I was seeing and hearing. The different people I was meeting, both Chinese who had grown up in the People's Republic and were at school. Were at the same school as me, but studying English, for instance, as well as a lot of overseas Chinese I was meeting from different parts of the world, say from the U.S. or from Germany, other parts who were coming to Beijing to study Chinese that summer, from Hong Kong as well. So I just thought it was like such a fascinating environment, and I think it was what started me on this like lifelong interest in China, that then became a intense professional interest.
Now, was that your first time in China, or had you been before?
That was my very first time in China. I'd never been to Hong Kong or China before. At that time, Hong Kong was still a British colony, 1996. It was the very tail end of Britain's rule over Hong Kong. I didn't go to Hong Kong that trip, but would go a year later in 1997, right before the handover. But it was my first time in China. I think my parents, when they moved to the U.S., they never ended up going visiting China or Hong Kong afterwards. I mean, my parents have both, in their own ways, fled China at different times, so I don't think they had a huge desire to go to the People's Republic when we were in D.C. But I know that my mother wanted to visit Hong Kong and she missed her family and friends there. But I think that they felt that they had to save money. We didn't have a lot of money, and so they didn't make a lot of money at their jobs. My mother worked as an accounting clerk at a moving company in Alexandria. So I think that they just felt that the plane fares to go back to Asia were very expensive and they didn't make trips back there. Plus, by throughout the 80s and 90s, all their closest family members had moved over to America, so they didn't have extremely close family members anymore even in Hong Kong.
So you go back to China, and this is part of like your kind of grad school, right, in
Right.
journalism. And
It's the start that the my first trip to China was the summer before grad school. Then I entered grad school in journalism at Berkeley, and of course, there's being on the West Coast, being the Bay Area. There's a lot more overt. There are many more overt connections to China there. Both among the Chinese American community that's very robust out in the Bay Area as well as in Berkeley, as well as commercial interest in other things. So it was, so, and then so I was studying journalism. Then I decided I was going to do a double master's degree and spend 3 years at Berkeley. And the double master's would be international studies as well, because I knew that there was a future I could envision where I would be a foreign correspondent, be an international correspondent, and I wanted to be posted overseas and to China more than anywhere else. And so I studied while I was studying journalism. I also continued studying Mandarin at Berkeley, and then I also did courses that were in things like Chinese history, Chinese society, and then I think that's what really got me thinking in a much more intellectual manner about China.
um, and in your bio, I know that you were stationed in Iraq.
Yeah.
Um, but like, how did you wind up there, and what took you there? What I mean, eventually, I want to ask about like just your impression of it, and just
Right.
maybe just the misconceptions that a lot of us have about Iraq itself and the culture. But
Yeah.
start off with just the reason you went there.
Sure. Um, and we'll talk about Iraq, but then I want to circle back to talking about my interest in China and how that
Mm.
the intellectual interest merges with like family history and family interest in China as well. So, but Iraq. So as I was saying, I wanted to be a foreign correspondent, and then I got an internship at the New York Times in the summer of '98. Did an internship there. Came to New York. Was living here. Went back and finished my degree, my second degree, came back to New York to continue an internship at the Times, and then ended up staying there because that internship turned into an entry into a training program for younger reporters, and then that became a full-time job. So I ended up working at different desks in New York between '99 and 2003. Metro, business, sports. I was a sports writer for a year. These were all, I saw them all as like sort of training grounds since I was a fairly junior reporter and I was filling different jobs, general reporting jobs on different desks at the New York Times. Then I was living in New York, in Manhattan, when 9/11 happened. Um, the towers came down, and then America entered the next phase of its history, which was a long period of being engaged in wars overseas. And first, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, and then the Iraq War started in March of 2003. At that time, I was on the business desk, and I knew I really wanted to be working overseas, and I was very much interested in these wars that the U.S. was engaged in. And when the foreign editor at the time was looking around for different volunteers to go over to report on Iraq because the invasion had happened, they were cycling different reporters through. They were interested in having business reporters go in at the time because they thought that there was a, potential stories about reconstruction, about rebuilding Iraq, about growing commercial ties that Iraq would have with other countries and the oil industry. But so I went there as a business reporter, and I went in the fall of 2003, which is when the insurgency was starting to gain steam. And so, like, I entered the country essentially when the insurgency gained momentum and American troops were coming under violent assault. And it was clear that many Iraqis saw this as a coercive occupation and not sort of like this big liberation that the Bush administration had sold a lot of people on. So I then stayed on as it became a full-blown war story. It was not a story of commerce or of reconstruction. It was a story about war and about the U.S. being involved in this insurgent war that was of its own making. And so, and I ended up staying there for a total of 3.5 years, from the fall of 2003 up until summer of 2007, and it was a very intense period. I think a lot of people know, obviously what the circumstances were. I think that now, when you look back on that war, there's a consensus opinion in the U.S. on both sides of the political spectrum, both ends of it, as well as in the middle, that this is a total disaster and that the U.S. should never have been involved in this war to begin with.
Yeah, maybe we can now return to the story of China. It's obviously like a very personal one for you, but I mean, you go there, I think starting in 2008 is when you start
Yeah,
being based there, and
yeah.
is this sort of post Olympics or pre? What was China like at that time?
Yeah, it was. I should go rewind a bit and go back to my grad school days because I think that, and we can talk a little bit more about this after we talk about my time with the New York Times China. But there were parallel tracks of interest I had in China that started to grow during my grad school years when I was in my 20s, and one was obviously the sort of intellectual track where I was taking academic courses on China and studying the Chinese language. But then, of course, now I became a lot more interested in my family history with China too. So it wasn't just like, oh, I'm studying Chinese as like this, like from this detached perspective, or studying Chinese society and history from this detached perspective. I became much more interested in what my parents' background had been in China before they moved to the U.S. And I hadn't asked them a lot about that when I was growing up. I think I was just like many, Chinese American kids in my generation growing up in the suburbs. We just wanted to like fit into this American monoculture, and we weren't that interested necessarily in our parents' cultural upbringing. But then, so I started to ask my parents more on my breaks home from school when I would come back to DC, and I decided to actually sit them down for formal interviews. I think because I was trained to be a journalist and I had already done some journalism, I was like, well, it's important to sort of get their words down formally, sort of, what we're doing right now in front of the camera. And so I sat them down, started taking notes at night as I interviewed them about their times in China and Hong Kong. And it was during one of these sessions that, and I had a video camera going, recording it, that my father decided to take this photograph and put it in the palm of my hand. And it's this photograph here that is on the front cover of my book. And it's also on the spine of my book. And it's a photograph of him in a People's Liberation Army uniform taken in around 1953 when he was posted out in the northwest frontier region of China. And it was like the first time that I had heard in any detail about the fact that he had been a soldier in the Chinese army under Mao, and that he had spent time out in the far western regions of China. And then that in that photograph, what's interesting is like there's this photograph of him wearing the cap. I think that a lot of us are familiar with, and sort of like the jacket, and the cap. When I was looking at the photograph that he put in my hand, there's a like little shadow in the spot where there would usually be a red star, which signifies the People's Liberation Army, but there was a shadow, like a dark smudge there instead. And he told me that he had that photograph taken in 1953. Then eventually he manages to mail it from the People's Republic to his father in in Hong Kong, which was still a British colony at the time. His father was working as a merchant, as an herbal medicine merchant there. And his father got the photograph and then became very alarmed by it because he thought that if the British authorities found him with this photograph of his son in the People's Liberation Army, he would get in trouble. So then he sort of airbrushed out the red star on the cap. So these were some of the stories I heard from my father when I was in my 20s, going back and forth to DC from Berkeley, and then that these stories imprinted themselves in my mind. And right after graduating Berkeley, but before returning to New York to continue my internship with the New York Times, I took a 3-month trip in Asia. And what I did was I flew to Hong Kong. It was my second time in Hong Kong because I visited in the summer of '97, right before handover, both as a grad student doing a course related to Hong Kong and as a freelance journalist. But I came back in 1998, the summer, flew in there, and then did a really long overland trip across China that took me from Hong Kong through southern China, through all the way up to northwest China into the Xinjiang region, which is where my father had been posted as a soldier. And he had told me that he had been posted to that area and told me some of the parts of that area had been posted. So I made some trips to these very remote parts of Xinjiang, which is on the border with Kazakhstan. And that was when I started to really realize, what my father's postings really had meant, that he was really out in this border region that was very sensitive, that had different people from different ethnicities and cultures. They were not of the majority Han ethnicity in China. They were Uyghur Muslims, Kazakh Muslims, people like that, and he was living among them as part of this military occupation. And so, it helped fill in a lot of the gaps in my head of what my father had been doing, or the region where he had been posted. And then I went to Pakistan, and then ended my trip in Delhi in India, and then flew back to the U.S. from there. So that was my last really strong and lengthy encounter with China until, as you mentioned, I went there in 2008 as a correspondent for the New York Times. So after leaving China on that trip in 1999, I was, of course, as interested or obsessed with it as ever. But because I ended up in New York working for the Times and then went to Iraq, then I basically took this almost decade-long detour away from China. And it wasn't until 2008 when I came back to Beijing. I should say that, after I finished my tour in Iraq in summer of 2007, the Times often, back in those days, gave its journalists some period of language training if they weren't completely fluent in the language. And it's been a long time since I used Mandarin or studied Mandarin. So I asked them for some time to brush up on my Mandarin. And so I went to first a short summer language course at Middlebury in Vermont, but then went to Taipei in Taiwan to study for almost an academic year. And that made a huge difference because, one, it got my Mandarin to a much better level, but also it also immersed me in Taiwan, which is a very different place than either Hong Kong or the People's Republic, even though it has this, part of it is steeped in Chinese culture because of the ways of immigrants there. And, a large part of it is steeped in indigenous Taiwanese culture as well. And so it was a very interesting place to be, and gave me a different perspective on that that part of Asia. So that was important to me. And then I went to Beijing in 2008 as a correspondent.
And what originally you weren't the bureau chief, right? So what was your beat,
Yeah.
in China at first?
I went there. Jim Yardley was a reporter who was working there as a bureau chief. and then and then during my time there, we rotated through various bureau chiefs, and I ended up as the bureau chief in my last 3 years or so there. But in at the beginning, my beat was mainly very wide. It was almost anything about Chinese society or culture. I was not that interested at the time in reporting on China's relations with the outside world or with other countries or its foreign policy, because I really wanted to focus on reporting on what was going on inside China itself. So, it ranged widely from environmental issues to the Olympics. So the like the preparation for the Olympics was a big thing. I went out to almost soon after, some months after I arrived in China, I went out to Xinjiang to report on an episode, a very strange episode of violence out there that I recount in my book. But I was interested in those western regions of China, both Xinjiang and Tibet, because of my knowledge of my family history out there, but also because on that long overland backpacking trip in 1999, I had gone through those regions and became very interested in the cultures and societies out there, and these include the Tibetan regions of Western China, as well as the Muslim regions in Xinjiang, or the northwest area of China. And so I would often find reasons to go out there to report on stories out there. I reported on for labor unrest in southern China, and there was a lot of that starting to happen in those years because China was trying to weather the global economic crisis that started in the American financial system. And China was able to get through it fairly okay because it started this huge stimulus program that included loosening bank lending. But, at the same time, there were also lots of factories that were struggling because of the global recession that was taking place. And so there was a lot of labor unrest that was associated with that, from people wanting their wages and people being laid off in the South. And so there were lots of different issues to report on all across China. There was no shortage of stories.
Did you talk to your parents about the work? How much were you communicating with them about like what you were doing, and how did they feel about it?
Yeah, I didn't talk in depth about them at the time because I think they were they could see what I was doing because of the stories. And I would talk with them every now and then. Of course, I came home every year and saw them, but they were interested in the work. They also wanted to make sure that I was safe, that I didn't do anything that would like land me in prison. I think my mother especially has been fearful of the type of repressive measures that the party can take, because she had, as I was saying, her family was persecuted by by communist officials back in the 1950s. My father was not as worried. I think he had seen the inside of the system, and although he had suffered in his own way in the People's Republic during his years there, he also saw that there were had a more nuanced understanding, I think, of the system and of how you can navigate it, and how it's not really necessarily like a black and white thing with the Communist Party. I think there's a certain sense of pride that they had in the fact that I was writing about China for a large and well-known American newspaper, that I was one of the few correspondents based in China itself for a big American news organization. I was Chinese and had somehow made my way back to the motherland and was reporting on it and was experiencing it, and in a way seeing it for the family. It was sort of like a proxy of the family out there. They had never gone back to live in China ever again. They visited once in 1999 while I was in my final year of grad school, and because I was still finishing up grad school, I didn't go with them. But they and my sister came to China on a brief tour at the time, and saw the tourist highlights of Beijing and Guangxi and other places like that. But now I was actually living in Beijing, which I think is a very different than just coming there as a tourist. And so I think that for them it was something special. And of course their friends and family members all saw the stories I was writing from China.
Yeah, and I want to move on to talking about like the book you just wrote or just came out, and
Yeah.
sort of where did the genesis of the idea come from?
Yeah. So I'll just hold up the book again, and so it's it's called "At the Edge of Empire: A Family's Reckoning with China," and I think that there's the title and the subtitle say a lot already about what it is and what the themes I'm groping for here in this book. And so when during the end of my time in China, which was around 2015, 2016, I knew I wanted to write a longer work about China, that I wasn't satisfied with just having written many news articles or feature stories about China over nearly a decade. And I thought I would put those thoughts together in a book. And I thought the book would be intended to tell the average person, the average American or other English reader about China today, what China was as a country today under the rule of the Communist Party, and the transition to Xi Jinping's rule, and but also and what China's place was in the world today. But I also wanted to both imprint it with a very personal perspective and be very upfront with the reader that in a way this is a subjective history of China, and as well as put it in the context of Mao era history. And so I thought, these are all very complicated strands of narratives that we pull together and big themes. And I thought, what's the easiest, most like down to earth way that I can pull a reader along through a book length narrative, and keep them grounded in this vast country. And I thought family history was probably the best story that I could tell that would pull the reader through all these different themes I was trying to hit. And so my father's story in China, in his 12 years post high school in China, and his half dozen years in the army, I thought would be the most interesting way of telling about Mao era history. And then I would sort of marry that with the narrative of me going to China in 2008 as a correspondent and then bureau chief for the New York Times, and the observations that I had and the reporting that I did during those years, and what that said about China today. So I think I would marry those two stories together, interlink them, and then what it would do was it would tell the story of China today, but also give the reader the proper context from Mao era China, which I think is very important for understanding China. I don't think that you can just look at China right now and try and understand it without knowing the history of where it came from in those early years of communist rule. And so I thought my father's story was very important for that, because the way I see China, in terms of both the geopolitical context, but also in the context of the way that many Chinese citizens, as well as its leaders, understand the country today, is that it's in many ways a reconstituted empire, which is, of course, right in the title, At the Edge of Empire. And it's a reconstituted empire from the days when, in the High Qing era, the Manchu rulers in Beijing had undertaken these wars of conquest that had brought all these far reaches of Asia into what they called the Chinese Empire, and that includes Xinjiang, the northwest region, includes Tibet, it includes to a degree the island of Taiwan, and so when the communists took over China from the nationalists, they won the Civil War in '49. What the communists wanted to do was they wanted to piece back together that empire that the Qing had ruled. The nationalists had the same ambitions, but they were not successful at it. They didn't have the force of means to keep that empire together or to rebuild it. The communists sent armies out to the west to do that reconquest. My father was one of the soldiers that went out there in 1950, and so I thought that was an important story to tell, because I think that idea of China as a reconstituted empire is very much core to the Chinese national identity today, to the goals of the Communist Party, and to the way that it legitimizes itself in both internally within the party, but also in the eyes of Chinese citizens, and even in the eyes of many overseas Chinese as well. I think that there's been this misframing of the legitimacy of the party through the years. Many people have said, oh, because it has managed to have this rapid economic growth, that underpins the legitimacy of the party. I think that factor is very important, but I also think that its ability to maintain what it sees as the territorial integrity of China is also very important for the legitimacy of the party. And so, because when you talk to a lot of overseas Chinese, include especially those Chinese of my parents' generation, they very much see China through the prism of like the map and the boundaries of China, and they're like, this is what China is. It's like, and it includes, and invariably in their minds includes places like Xinjiang, like Tibet, and Hong Kong. Now that the British have handed it back, and of course many of them think it should include Taiwan. So. So many of the things we talk about, the issues we talk about today, in terms of U.S.-China relations, in terms of the geopolitics of China, can all be seen, I think, and understood through this prism of the Chinese empire today.
Yeah. Were those interviews that you did with your parents, when you were in grad school, were those kind of like the source of part of your book, or did you go back and do re-interviews with your dad, and what was the kind of research process like?
I did go back and look at those notes again from my 20s. They were important. They were foundational to my later understanding of China, and I thought a lot about the stories that they had told me when I was living in China itself, and it helped me understand places like Xinjiang when we travel out there. But they were not in enough detail to write a book based on them. So what I had to do was I had to then sit down with my parents, especially my dad, of course, and sit down with them again in the childhood home, the same place I interviewed them in my 20s and where they were still living, and really get them to talk in much greater detail about their time in China, and especially my father about his time in the PLA when he was out in the Northwest. And so I would spend hours and hours talking with him and recording the interviews, typing up notes, and then I would carefully review each of those as I wrote each chapter in the book. He's not that reluctant to tell those stories. Like some of the parts of those stories are traumatic of his time in China. Parts of it he remembers with a lot of nostalgia, because I think he thinks back to that period when he was in his 20s and embracing this idea of a greater cause, of a cause much bigger than himself or any individual citizen. The cause of communism, of communist revolution. And I think he really looks back on that with nostalgia, because I think there are few times in one's life when you can feel yourself devoted passionately to a project that's bigger than yourself. I think a lot of young people look for something like that, and sometimes they find it, sometimes it's misguided, as my father later came to believe, but at the same time, when you're wrapped up in it, there's a sense of intensity, I think, that you can't find in other parts of your life. And so he remembers, he has sharp memories of many of the episodes from those moments in his 20s. Things like marching in Tiananmen Square on the first anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic, when there were students, factory workers, soldiers all marching past Mao, who was standing high up on Tiananmen Gate along with Mao's closest colleagues, and then they were looking down at the people marching. My father and others were looking up at them. A few weeks after that, my father drops out of university in Beijing to enroll in the military, and that starts, that sets the course of his life for the next half dozen years at least. When he goes to the northeast of China to try and train to fight the Americans of the Korean War, but then it is instead sent out to the northwest of China in Xinjiang. So my father would tell me about those, and we did it in a very formal setting through these long interviews.
At what point did he start to feel like, like that he started to believe that the Communist Party, that the idealism he had was kind of wearing off?
Yeah, that's a. I mean, that took a very sharp turn. His history took a very sharp turn, I should say, starting in the late 1950s. And what happened was, after he spent half a dozen years out in Xinjiang in these borderlands, he felt he had put a lot of time into into trying to help build up the nation. He had made sacrifices for the party and for the military. And he knew when he was sent out there, rather than to Korea to fight the Americans, that the communists were suspicious of his family background. The fact that he came from a merchant family in Hong Kong, capitalist family, the fact that his brother had gone off to study in America, and then had started working for the U.S. government as an engineer. He knew these were black marks on his family, and of course, the party back in those days it was constantly looking for things in people's background, and had suspicions of people that had strong ties to the West, which my father did invariably. And so, but he felt that he was able to move past those because he spent a half dozen years out in the Northwest. His military superiors had recommended him for membership to the party, even. And so he back to school in the heartland of China, in the provincial capital of Xi'an, to a polytechnic university there that was associated with the PLA. And his goal at that point was to finish his studies and help build military aircraft for the PLA. But several things happened in the late 1950s. One was that officials at the school approached him and told him he would not be joining the party soon. They said that his application was stalled, and that they would have to investigate his family background further because they still harbored suspicions about his family background. And then he realized, oh, no matter how much I sacrifice for the party, they'll never trust me. That's one thing. Another was that Mao started his Great Leap Forward industrialization project, and that led to the Great Famine, the worst man-made famine in modern history, where 30 to 40 million Chinese died. My father survived, as did his classmates at the university, but they were very ill. They were bedridden, sometimes for weeks on end. They had a very difficult time walking. They starved. And so my father realized that the bigger project of sort of rebuilding China was being taken down the wrong path by Mao. And Mao had also started to purge some of his closest colleagues in the top ranks of the party, including military commanders that my father had once looked up to, like Peng Dehuai. And so my father knew that there's something wrong with the project of rebuilding China, the project of securing the party's future under Mao. And so he then decided he had to leave the People's Republic, both because his personal ambitions had been stymied, but also because he saw China going down this like dark path. And so in the early 60s, he made a plan with relatives who were still down in Guangdong province to get the proper travel permits to sneak across or slip across the border from the People's Republic to Macau, and then eventually to Hong Kong, his birth city, where he reunite with his parents. And he executed that whole plan from around 1961 to 62, when he pretended he was very ill and had to drop out of university for a year to stay in Guangzhou, and then got the help of his relatives and the help of a police officer to get those travel documents.
Wow, so it's very kind of harrowing sort of escape
Yeah, he had to
from.
keep it secret. He had to pretend he was going to come back to China. Many Chinese were trying to escape the People's Republic at that time because of the Great Famine. And so a lot of Chinese were actually trying to swim across to Hong Kong from Guangdong province, and a lot were dying in the waters between Guangdong and Hong Kong. And my father, fortunately, found a better way to escape, which is to call in a favor from this police officer that owed the family a favor and get those travel documents.
Wow. So he never became a Communist Party member officially.
No, he
but
never joined the party,
Yeah,
and that was one of the reasons why he decided to leave.
I see.
Yeah.
Wow. Um, and yeah, I wanted to ask you about the process of writing this book. You know, what was like the hardest, the most challenging part of doing this? Uh, book? Was it more sort of personal and emotional, or was it something else, like something
Yeah,
logistical, perhaps?
I think the hardest thing was writing the chapters about my father, because when you're obviously when I'm writing the contemporary chapters about China, and it's probably the balance is half and half in the book. The contemporary chapters about China, about my experience, are much easier to write because I was there. I'm writing about what I saw, what I heard, the people I met. But with my father, I have to really imagine what it was like to be in his place at that time and base it on the interviews, based on historical research. I did a lot of reading on historical books and texts, some primary sources, many secondary sources of those periods. So, like Hong Kong in 1941 under the Japanese invasion and occupation, uh, Guangdong province during the Chinese Civil War, and then the Communist victory. Xinjiang in the 1950s, a very remote area of which there aren't that many records of what was going on back then. So these are all places that and periods of time that I haven't experienced myself, and so I'm relying on the memories of my father. I'm relying on historical texts, and I'm trying as I'm writing the chapters. I'm trying to like balance between giving readers a bigger picture understanding of what was going on in China and in those regions at the time, as well as focusing on the particular memories of my father and his story. So like it's a writing challenge as well. You're juggling these two things, and you're trying to make those areas and that period come alive for readers, and to really make them feel like they're there. So I because I believe in sort of like this idea of immersive narrative nonfiction, where like you want it to feel like a novel that that the reader is immersed in a story that's pulling them along. Plus, they have a real understanding of the setting, and the tactile feel of the place as well.
Right.
So I wanted to have all those elements in each of the chapters, and the chapters set in the past were much harder to write than the chapters set in the present, in my opinion. Also, I would say that another challenge is to really capture the emotional resonance of what my father was feeling at any given time. Like I wanted to make sure that I could convey to the reader, his perception of what he was seeing, what he was hearing, and what he was feeling about his experiences. When he was doing things like being his day to day life as a soldier out there in the Northwest, but also at moments when, for instance, he discovers that the party or officials in the party want to investigate him and his family further, like these big pivotal moments in his life. And so I had to rely on going back to him over and over during the interviews to really try and pin that down, as well as having him fact check and proofread like each chapter that I wrote about him to make sure that the emotional balance was right in what I was trying to convey about what he was feeling.
So he did read this and kind of fact check I guess his part of it.
Yeah, he was very much involved in the process, and as I finished the drafts of each chapter that had him as the main protagonist in them, I would ask him to read over those chapters, and I would also ask his older brother, my uncle Sam, to do the same, because Sam is the family historian and has a very deep knowledge of the family history and of China itself.
I see. And just in terms of your writing process, continuing on that line, how do you like to write? I mean, like I think writers have their specific process and environment that they want to work in. Like what is it for you? Is it like, do you wake up in the morning and that's when you do it, or
Yeah.
what's your rhythm?
My writing on the book was different than the writing when I do newspaper articles. But in general, I would say morning is the best time, by far the best time for me to write. So for the book, I would generally try and I set a goal for myself of writing 500 to 800 words a day. I would try and do the bulk of that in the morning. When during the early part of writing the book, when I moved down here to Washington after doing a fellowship at Harvard, I was in Washington starting the book project. I had just gotten the contract. I would wake up early at like 5 a.m. and try and do some research and some writing before I started my workday. I did that off and on for that year, and eventually down the road, I got a book leave from the New York Times and was able to devote the full day to both research and to writing, and was doing fellowship at the Wilson Center in D.C. at this time too. So my general aim was to try and like get those several hundred words down in a very rough format before the afternoon, because I think that my energies are best in the morning. And I always keep in mind that the main thing is to get the words down. Like, you don't need the words in the census don't have to be perfect. You can go back and revise them. I'm a big believer in always like having the option of going back and revising and keeping that in mind, so that it doesn't I don't hit blocks because I don't try and be a perfectionist on that first draft. And then when I went back and started rewriting the chapters, like I would finish one chapter and then go back and rewrite it, and would realize, oh, actually, you know what? My first instinct on a lot of these sentences seemed to be right. Like, I didn't have to do a ton of rewriting as I was going back through each chapter. So so part of my belief also is that, like, oftentimes your first instincts when you're a writer often turn out to be the best instincts.
Yeah. Um, how do you think the book kind of would be received in China, or has it been read by
Right.
people there, and what do people feel about it? What's the response been?
Yeah, I mean, I have some friends who are not Chinese who read the book in manuscript form, who are in China. They very much enjoyed the book. I have not had sort of someone who's in the Chinese. I have not gotten any reaction from, say, someone in the Chinese government who's read it. I don't know if anyone there has read it. I don't think that, at least under the current system in China, there's any way that a Chinese publishing house would publish this book, for instance, because I just think that the topics are way too sensitive for a book published in the People's Republic. Like, the book grapples with issues like the military occupation of Xinjiang, of which my father was a part of, the Beijing's policies in the Tibetan areas, the sort of protests in Hong Kong in 2014 and 2019, and then the government reaction to those. So these are all sort of like issues that are very sensitive, I think, with the party, and so I doubt it will be published in China under the current iteration of the party. It some months ago it did get published in Taiwan, so I think that I'm hopeful that that Chinese edition will circulate among Chinese readers, whether they're in the People's Republic or overseas. It's in complex characters, like traditional characters or fontitsa, not the simplified ones that are common in the mainland. So I think it might be a bit harder for Chinese who grew up on the mainland to read it, but I'm still hopeful that that edition will reach a Chinese language audience.
Yeah. And do you have plans for like the next book project, or are you kind of taking a break from thinking about that while this book is in circulation? What's your upcoming sort of plans?
Right now, because of the intensity of reporting on the second Trump administration, its foreign policy, I have not put my energies into thinking about the next book project. I do have some vague ideas in my mind, which I might pursue sometime soon, but I haven't committed myself to those yet. So, and I'm also very happy right now, going around and talking about this book, because I do think that it's interesting to engage with audiences, especially in live settings, about the book and about the subject matter. Some people who come to my talks have read the book and they have some feedback on it, and some people have not read the book but are interested in the material I'm presenting from the book at my talks. And so I've been giving talks all across the U.S., in D.C., in New York, in California, in Texas, and I just came back recently from the Auckland Writers Festival and the Sydney Writers Festival on the other side of the world. I traveled to India earlier this year with the book, to the Jaipur Literature Festival, and then I went to Edinburgh last year, and we'll go back to the Edinburgh Book Festival this summer. So I've been traveling around the world talking about the book. There's been a lot of interest in it because of China's place in the world today. And I think people are looking for a way to understand China and to understand more about people who've come from China. One of the reasons why I wrote the book was to give, a voice to the many immigrants, especially the older immigrants that we've seen who've left China, but whose backstories we don't really know that well. And I think that growing up in the U.S., you always see these people from China, especially in service industries, at least in my milieu, like people who work in restaurants, who work in laundry shops, and you wonder, oh, what's their backstory? And I think many Americans encounter these Chinese immigrants, but don't really know how complex their stories or their family histories, as well as the national histories that they live through. Sometimes traumatic histories, oftentimes histories that are imbued with politics, and so I really felt I wanted to bring that alive for people. So as part of that project, I've been going around doing as many talks as possible in between my day job on the book because I think it's important to get that message out to people. Especially, I think now at a time when we're in this period in American history where there's a lot of, there's a lot of debate about immigration in America, and we see the Trump administration really taking a very forceful and critical approach to immigration. And I think that there should be a much more nuanced discourse around immigration.
I just want to ask you a couple just quick take things. Chinatowns, your relationship to that place, that neighborhood,
Yeah.
whether it be like New York's or Washington
Right.
D.C.'s, just like what's your kind of, I don't know,
Yeah.
gut level
I mean, I
reaction
feel
to
very comfortable. I mean, I have very sharp memories of DC Chinatown in the 80s because, obviously I don't remember much from the first year of my life because I was so young then, and that's when I was living there. But we would go back to Chinatown every week because my grandmother lived there. And she lived in a senior housing complex in Chinatown. So we spent a lot of time there. And we would always go to like community gatherings in Chinatown. My father and my uncle Sam were very much involved in the life of Chinatown, DC, and helped run organizations and set up meetings and events there. So it's very much a part of my upbringing. I think about it with intense nostalgia. It's very different now. For anyone who's been to DC Chinatown and knew it back in the 80s and 90s, they know it's very different now. There's not as many Chinese who live there. Many moved out to suburbs. There's a lot of non-Chinese commercial interest in Chinatown. So it's very different now. And occasionally I bring my daughter there for events or to go see movies or things like that. But it's not quite the same Chinatown that I grew up with. When I was living here in New York in my 20s, when I was working for the New York Times, I lived here for around 4 years. And I lived in Soho, which is only a 10 to 15-minute walk from Chinatown. So Chinatown became almost like my backyard. Like I would come here often on the weekends or even after getting off work at night. I would meet up with friends here for dinner. And I also started exploring a lot of the neighborhood. I got to know Canal Street, Mott Street, Mulberry Street very well. Sometimes I thought about, where my dad and his mom, my grandmother, had spent some of their time after they had moved to the U.S. in 1967, because, as I said, they had spent some time working and living here in Chinatown. And I remember my dad had worked in a restaurant on Mott Street, for instance, briefly. So, and it also felt very familiar to me because it was still, at the time, it was like going through this interesting transition where parts of it were still very much Cantonese speaking, and parts of it were, Fujianese speaking, like immigrants. Down by the Manhattan Bridge, it was much more Fujianese. Up on Mott Street, it was still very much Cantonese. So it was like very fascinating seeing that transition. And of course, I could understand Cantonese very easily, moving around, and Mandarin to a certain degree. So I was very comfortable with that. And then in my professional life, covering New York for the Times, both on the City Weekly edition when that existed, and then for the Metro section, like I made Chinatown and the Chinese immigrant experience into almost a mini beat and would seek out stories here. So when I was an intern in '98 for the City Weekly edition, the very first story I did for the New York Times was about a labor dispute that was happening at Jingfeng Restaurant, which is right across the street from where you and I are sitting right now. And so even from the very first words I wrote for the New York Times for publication, I was already like planting roots here in New York, Chinatown, in that sense. So I got to know some of the personalities here. I got to know the little mini neighborhoods, Mott Street, Lower East Side, the more Fujianese areas of by the Manhattan Bridge, and I thought it was just like fascinating the diversity of just this one neighborhood. I think for a lot of outsiders, they think of it as this like monolith, but I think if you really delve into it, and you know this better than I do, that there's an enormous range of cultures, languages, backgrounds here in Chinatown. That's what's made it interesting to me.
And then talk about your first experiences coming to Mocha, the 70 Mulberry Building.
Oh yeah. When I was working here for the Times, I visited the original Mocha in its old building, and I think that one of the things that I latched onto and that really got me interested in the work of Mocha is the fact that it had this very specific focus on the different regions of China from which many immigrants came. And for me, of course, I'd grown up in this Cantonese setting, but also this specific Toisanese or Hoisanese setting. And so I knew that, a lot of the Chinatowns and Chinese immigrant experience in the 20th century was shaped by immigration from Toisan, Taishan in Mandarin. And so I thought what was really interesting was that the museum had these very specific exhibitions and detailed accounts of immigration from Toisan County. And I thought that was a very rich educational experience for me, and I think for many others whose families have come from that county and from that region. I thought that was one of the valuable things that the museum brought, I think, to New York. So, for instance, there's many prominent people who've come from Toisan County. One of them is Gary Locke, who is a cousin of my family, happens to be a cousin of my family in my father's generation, like a cousin of my father. They're related through my father's mother's side of the family, as well as the Gary Locke's mother's side. And so he came from Toisan County as well. And so like I thought a lot about that county and its influence on Chinese immigration around the world. And so I think that seeing that spelled out, expounded upon in the original Mocha is really interesting to me.
Well, I think we can end it here, but I wanted to see if you had anything that you wanted to say that we might not have gotten to.
Yeah, I think that no, I think we've covered a lot of ground. I think that we're in the for the last several years now, we've been in this period when U.S.-China relations has been on this very tense path, and I think it's important to have these oral histories and to have Chinese Americans talking about their experiences and talking about their own encounters with that immigrant experience, both here in America as well as their ties to China and their thinking about China, because I think it helps bring a much more fulsome discourse to the public, rather than sort of like this real black and white way of looking at America and at China that I think emerges in places like Washington, but that is very far from the reality of like what's taking place in people's day-to-day lives.
Actually, I did have one more question, which is just as a Chinese American journalist or Asian American journalist at the New York Times, or more broadly as a member of the press, like what is that like for you? Have you kind of faced challenges because of being Chinese American in this field, or what has it been like in general for you?
Yeah, I think that, my field's mostly been international news, and I think that it's actually worked to my advantage in the topics I cover, because one, I bring in sort of a more international outlook. I think because of my background, obviously because of my studies as well. So and then being posted China, like it gave me certain advantages. I think that if you are a Chinese American journalist in China, there are certain advantages that you might have. Just the way you look allows you to get in and out of places without attracting a lot of attention. I think people have a different see you in a different light, like potential sources or Chinese citizens you meet. There's different ways in which they might relate to you rather than a reporter who's not of Chinese background. I think it also complicates the way that the government sees you, so that they're not they might. I think they try and put people in different categories, but if you're Chinese American with very strong roots in America, they're not quite sure. Sometimes their officials might not be sure exactly how to approach you, which I think it can be advantageous. I also think that working in places like the Middle East, it's been in some ways advantageous also to be ethnic Chinese, because I've been in covering the Iraq War. Like I could sort of code switch, and people wouldn't, like, sometimes you don't want people to see you as American, even though like they know you're working for an American news organization. You don't want them necessarily to see you as like, oh, American, because of the very strong feelings that the American occupation inspired in Iraq. So being like telling people, oh, my parents are from Hong Kong or something like that, might be able to like open some doors or soften the edges on some interview situations, things like that. So I think in many ways, on my beat, at least in my field, it's been something that I've been able to use to my advantage, or that has been advantageous for me. I also think that, I've lots of Chinese American colleagues, other colleagues who report on issues like immigration, issues related to Asian Americans. And I think that they're bringing, especially today, I think that having people of their background and having that diversity of voices within the newsroom is really important, because like you want to be able to bring more nuance to the conversations that are taking place within the newsroom. I think it's very important. I think that people should be active in the newsroom in terms of making their perspectives known to editors or to managers or to others.
Well, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks.
Yeah, and good luck with the tour, and hopefully you'll
Right.
see you back here in
Yeah,
like the
let's
fall.
like do
Let's
something in the fall here in Mocha. That would be great.
Cool,
Yeah.
for sure.
Thanks, sir.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah.